The Duke married to protect his reputation, but on their wedding night his heart betrayed his pride. The candlelight trembled as if the room itself held its breath. Ashcombe House, that venerable fortress of grey stone and inherited duty, had been transformed into a wedding bower. White orchids bound with silver ribbon, the air thick with lavender and expectation. Yet the drawing-room felt less like celebration and more like trial. The fire crackled low in the grate, and somewhere beyond the curtained windows, rain fell upon London's streets with a persistence that seemed to mirror the whispers of the Tun. Evelyn stood before the looking-glass, her wedding dress, cream silk, with the barest suggestion of lace at the throat, falling precisely as it ought. Everything was correct. Everything was impeccable. Everything was false. "You are trembling," said Mrs. Agnes Bell, whose voice carried the weight of 30 years in service at Ashcombe. The housekeeper's reflection appeared in the glass beside her own, a woman of severe composure and eyes that saw too much. "This is not the trembling of joy, Miss Evelyn." Evelyn did not turn. To turn would be to surrender some small territory of her own making, and she had so little left. "Trembling is a natural response to momentous change, Mrs. Bell, nothing more." "Natural?" the housekeeper repeated, the word itself a gentle reproof. "Yes, as natural as a marriage made for the world's satisfaction rather than the heart's. I have known His Grace since he was a boy. I have never seen him choose anything for sentiment." Outside, the chapel clock struck 4:30. In 30 minutes she would become Duchess of Ashcombe. In 30 minutes the scandal would cease to matter. The whispers about her previous employer, Lord Markham's wife, had called her distressingly intimate with household matters, which was society's way of suggesting impropriety where there had been only efficiency, would be swallowed by the greater shock of a duke marrying a woman of no particular fortune. The marriage would neutralize the danger. It would make her untouchable by remaining simply invisible. That was the arrangement. That was the understanding that had passed between them in his study 3 weeks prior, when he had stood before the window with his hands clasped behind his back and said, without preamble, "Your situation has become untenable. My situation has become equally so. A marriage would resolve both difficulties. Are you willing to be practical?" She had been willing. She had been grateful. She had said nothing about the way her chest had contracted at the sight of him in morning light, at the precise cut of his jaw, at the controlled distance he maintained, as though proximity to another human might compromise his authority. "Forgive me," Evelyn said to Mrs. Bell, drawing on gloves of pristine kid leather. "I'm anxious about propriety. A duchess must learn the traditions of Ashcombe quickly. I would not wish to disappoint His Grace through ignorance." The housekeeper's lips tightened nearly imperceptibly. "His Grace has never valued false sentiment, Miss Duchess now. He values honesty, which is rarer in these drawing-rooms than virtue itself. I would not obscure your true nature to please him. It is your true nature that gives him honor this day, whether he has admitted it or not." There was something in those words, a warning perhaps, or a kindness too large to accept without breaking. The carriage ride to the chapel was measured in silence. Evelyn sat opposite to the woman who had been engaged as her lady's maid for the season, a practical sort called Miss Hartwell, who asked no questions and arranged flowers with military precision. London streets unrolled past the windows, shop fronts closing for the evening, lamplights being lit against the gathering dusk, pedestrians hurrying past with their collars turned up against the rain. How ordinary the day seemed, how unmarked by the seismic shift occurring within those four walls moving through space. The chapel was small, as befitted a private ceremony. Only the immediate circle of society had been invited, a deliberate choice that spoke of dignity and economy rather than celebration. The Duke of Ashcombe did not require a theatrical production to prove his decisions. He required only the presence of witnesses sufficient to establish the fact as irrevocable. When she entered, he stood at the altar in charcoal grey morning coat, his dark hair disciplined into order, his face a study in composed attention. For one moment, only one, his blue eyes met hers. In that moment, she saw it, a fracture in the perfect architecture of his restraint, a tremor of something that might have been regret or fear, or a tenderness so carefully suppressed that it emerged only as a dangerous shadow across his features. Then the moment passed. He turned toward the clergyman, and she was left to interpret that glimpse as her own invention, a foolish hope constructed from the raw material of her own longing. The vows were exchanged with precision. "I, Benedict William Vane, Duke of Ashcombe, do take thee, Evelyn Mary Hearthmere." His voice was steady, not warm, but steady. She heard in that steadiness the same quality that characterized all his public utterances, the voice of a man who had learned that control was the only form of authority that could not be taken from him. When it came her turn, her voice wavered, barely, but perceptibly. She heard it and hated herself for it. "I, Evelyn Mary Hearthmere, do take thee, Benedict William Vane." The words felt like stepping from a cliff into darkness. The ring he placed upon her finger was simple gold, ancient, bearing the Ashcombe crest. As he slid it home, his hand did not tremble. His hand never trembled. The reception at Ashcombe House was a subdued affair. Champagne served in the drawing-room, pastries arranged with exact symmetry, remarks exchanged with the cautious cordiality of people navigating a situation they understood to be neither romantic nor entirely convenient. Lady Corinne Markham was present, dressed in violet silk that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, her smile affixed to her face with the precision of a surgical instrument. She kissed Evelyn's cheek with lips that did not warm, whispered something about unexpected turns and the charity of a generous heart, and moved away trailing perfume like a veil of insinuation. By 9 o'clock, the house had settled into evening quiet. The guests had departed. The servants had withdrawn to their quarters, and Evelyn found herself ascending the grand staircase, alone because he had excused himself to his study with a murmured statement about correspondence requiring attention, toward a suite she had never seen, a bed she had never slept in, a room that bore the weight of expectation like humidity before a storm. On the mantelpiece, beside a candelabrum of silver, there rested a pocket watch. She did not remember seeing it before, but she noticed it now, elegant, restrained, with hands that indicated 9:30. But when she leaned closer, she saw that the second hand was still. The watch had stopped. It had been stopped for some time, judging by the position of the hands, 4:30, the hour the scandal had first broken. She understood then, in that moment, why he kept it, not as a reminder of pain, but as a monument to the precise instant when his world had fractured. The watch did not tick. The watch would not measure time forward. The watch was a prisoner, like all of them, to the moment that had demanded everything be rearranged. Evelyn turned away from the mantelpiece. The rain continued its persistent percussion against the windows, and she waited in the darkness. The rain had not ceased. If anything, it had intensified through the night, as if the heavens themselves were determined to make morning reluctant, to delay the commencement of their marriage by drowning the dawn in grey silence. Evelyn had not slept. She had sat by the window in a dressing gown of rosewool, watching the streets of Mayfair transform into channels of water, watching lamplights blur into smeared circles of amber, watching the world continue its indifferent rotation while she remained suspended in a singular moment of profound uncertainty. When sunlight finally did penetrate the clouds, pale, diffident, scarcely confident of its own presence, the house was already moving with purposeful activity. The servants knew their mistress's name now. She heard it whispered in corridors, remarked upon in the servants' hall, incorporated into instructions with the careful neutrality of those executing duty without judgment. Her Grace will require tea. Her Grace has not yet descended. The Duchess wishes the correspondence sorted by region. She had not yet descended because she had not known how to descend. How does one step from a bedchamber where nothing has transpired into a household that now considers you bound? How does one enact the role of beloved when the marriage was contracted as military alliance? Two strategic forces united against mutual ruin. The breakfast room, when she finally arrived, was empty of the Duke. A note in his handwriting, precise as mathematics, rested against the silver pot of coffee. Business in Parliament this morning. Do not expect me before evening. Be comfortable in the house. Be comfortable in the house. As though comfort were a matter of permission, as though she might simply decide to relax and find the decision enacted. Evelyn read the note twice, then folded it with deliberate care and placed it in her pocket. What she wanted was to find him and demand to know what had passed between them in the darkness of that wedding night. What hesitation had kept him at the study until she heard his footsteps approach their shared door near midnight, then retreat as though he had reconsidered the entire enterprise. But she had not demanded. She had lain silent beneath the quilt, her heart performing athletic feats against her ribs, her breath measured to suggest sleep she did not possess. Instead, she had simply waited and waited and waited, as women have always waited, for the man to decide what came next. Mrs. Bell found her at mid-morning, standing in the library, surrounded by shelves that rose toward a ceiling obscured by shadow. "You have been reading all night," the housekeeper observed. It was not a question. "I have been arranging my thoughts," Evelyn replied, which was not quite a lie. Books could be arranged. Thoughts could not, despite every effort. "I wish to understand the scope of Ashcombe's holdings. The estate is substantial." "The estate is a responsibility," Mrs. Bell corrected gently. "His Grace has managed it with meticulous attention, but he has allowed nothing else to flourish. No company, no entertainments beyond what duty requires, no softness, one might say." The housekeeper paused, her hands folded before her, her eyes examining Evelyn with something approaching compassion. "A house can become a monument to what is feared, rather than a home for what is loved. Perhaps he prefers it so," Evelyn suggested quietly. "Perhaps he does," Mrs. Bell agreed. "But perhaps the man and the Duke are not the same creature, and one of them is lonely in a way that no amount of control can ameliorate. I have seen it before in my years. Pride is a terrible companion. It promises safety and delivers only isolation." Before Evelyn could respond, a disturbance arose in the entrance hall. Raised voices, the kind that suggested distress, attempting to maintain decorum, but failing at the effort. Mrs. Bell's expression shifted immediately into the professional neutrality of long service, and she excused herself with a brevity that suggested anticipation of trouble. Evelyn followed, unable to resist the pull of curiosity that drew her toward conflict, like moths toward flame. In the entrance hall, a woman stood dripping upon the marble floor, water streaming from a traveling cloak of midnight blue, her hair escaping from a bonnet that hung at a precarious angle, her face flushed with the particular fury of those who have been wronged and cannot immediately express it through socially acceptable channels. Behind her, a footman maintained an expression of polite helplessness. "I must see the Duke," the woman declared. "I have come directly from the country, without regard to propriety, because propriety is precisely what this marriage disregards. I am Lady Ashcombe's aunt, the Dowager Countess Hartwick, and I have a matter of grave import to discuss with my nephew." It was at this moment that the library door opened and the Duke himself emerged, apparently drawn by the commotion. He wore his morning coat still, his cravat tied with perfect precision, his expression settling immediately into the controlled attention he maintained for all official matters. But Evelyn saw it again. That fracture she had glimpsed at the altar. It flickered across his features when his gaze met hers, reflected in the mirror of the entrance hall, before his attention turned toward the waterlogged intruder, with a politeness so flawless it seemed almost cruel. "Aunt," he said, "I confess surprise at your arrival. The roads from Hampshire are poor in autumn, and I would not wish your comfort compromised. Pray, allow Mrs. Bell to attend you. We shall meet in the study once you have recovered from your journey." But the Dowager Countess's eyes had found Evelyn, standing half-concealed in the library doorway, and understanding flashed across her features like lightning illuminating landscape. "That is she, then," the woman said, her tone suggesting she had been confirmed in some long-held suspicion. "That is the woman for whom you have disgraced us all." The Duke's posture did not alter. His voice did not change inflection, but something in the quality of his stillness suggested a depth of winter that would not yield to spring. "You are overwrought from travel, aunt," he said. "I will not discuss this matter in the hall before servants and my wife. Mrs. Bell will show you to the guest rooms. We shall converse after you have rested." "After I have rested?" The Dowager Countess laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You wish me to restore my composure so that I might hear your justifications with a calm temper? How very like you, Benedict. How perfectly in character that you would manage even outrage as though it were a matter of business. Because it is business, aunt. The business of family, the business of reputation, the business of securing the future of an estate that will not maintain itself through sentiment." He turned toward Evelyn, and for the first time, she saw something genuine flicker through his controlled facade, a weariness so profound it seemed to age him. "This is my wife, Evelyn. She has been insulted in her own home. I suggest you tender your apology, or you will find yourself returned to the country on the evening train." The Dowager Countess's mouth opened, closed. She looked at Evelyn as though truly seeing her for the first time, and something in that regard softened, not warmth, but a recognition of personhood that had been absent moments before. "Forgive me," she said finally stiffly. "I have made assumptions. They were unkind." After Mrs. Bell had led her away, and the Duke had excused himself to the study with a brevity that suggested the encounter had disturbed something beneath his composure, Evelyn found herself alone in the entrance hall, with only the sound of rain and her own heart negotiating with her ribs. She had been called a disgrace. She had been the reason for insult directed at his family name. And he had defended her without hesitation, had placed her safety above his own convenience, had spoken as though her position in the house was already established and permanent. It was an act of kindness so unexpected that it took her breath away. And kindness, she understood with a sudden clarity that felt almost like sorrow, was far more dangerous than cruelty. With cruelty, one could maintain protective walls. With kindness, one had to consider the possibility that the walls were not there to protect one's heart, but to protect the heart of the man behind them. Evening descended upon Ashcombe House with the particular heaviness that belongs to autumn in London, the darkness arriving earlier each night, the air carrying the first sharp bite of approaching winter. Evelyn had spent the latter part of the day in the library, ostensibly cataloguing the collection of botanical texts that appeared to be the only reading material the late Duchess had selected for her personal devotion. In truth, she had read nothing. She had sat with a leather-bound volume of Constance's travels open upon her lap and had thought about the Duke, which was a pursuit as fruitless as attempting to read by moonlight. He had not appeared for luncheon. Mrs. Bell had reported in her efficient manner that His Grace had taken tea in the study and had requested that His Grace not be disturbed until evening. What had disturbed him? The arrival of his aunt and her accusations, or something else, something that had already been fractured before Lady Hartwick's waterlogged dramatic entrance had threatened to widen the breach. At 6:30, a footman came to inform her that the Duke requested her presence in the drawing-room. She had changed into an evening gown of deep green silk and had taken considerable time with her hair, and had told herself that these preparations were matters of propriety rather than the particular desire to be perceived as something approaching beautiful in his presence. The lie had become so familiar by that point that it required no active maintenance. He stood before the fire when she entered, the pocket watch resting openly in his palm. He was looking at it when she came through the door, and he did not immediately close his hand, did not immediately hide the object away in the manner of someone concealing something shameful. He simply stood there, permitting her to see that the watch was stopped, that its hands remained frozen at 4:30. "Forgive me," he said. His voice carried the quality of exhaustion that suggests effort rather than rest. "I have been unwell this afternoon. The interview with my aunt, it resurrected matters that I prefer to remain interred. I should not have brought that disturbance into your first full day as Duchess." "She called me a disgrace," Evelyn said quietly. She was testing him, she realized, as though his response to this statement might provide some answer to questions she was too uncertain to ask directly. "She implied that our marriage was an act of dissent." "She implied correctly," the Duke said. He closed his hand over the watch, and the gesture was so final it seemed to conclude something. "You are a gentlewoman of respectable family and exceptional education, but your fortune is inconsistent, and your position was precarious. My rank is ancient, and my estates are substantial, but scandal had begun to attach itself to my name. I married you to silence that scandal, and to provide you security. It is not an arrangement that improves your standing in society, but it is an arrangement that permits you to remain employed by family rather than subject to the whims of those less protective than I endeavor to be." It was the most direct statement he had made to her since the morning after their wedding, and it was precisely as cold and rational as she had feared it would be. Yet there was something in the way his hand trembled, barely, almost imperceptibly, that suggested the words were costing him something. The exterior of control remained intact, but she had begun to recognize that there was something human beneath that control, something that yearned toward connection even as it retreated from it. "I understand," she said, and she did understand. She understood that he had constructed his entire life as a fortress against exactly this sort of vulnerability. She understood that his kindness this morning had been an act of defending an investment rather than an expression of regard. She understood all of this, and still her heart persisted in its futile rebellion. "Do you?" he asked. The question itself was odd, as though he were not certain what she was meant to understand, only that understanding was necessary to whatever came next. "I have spent 3 weeks constructing a justification for this marriage. I have anticipated every objection your presence in this house might raise. I have arranged for your security, your position, your future, and yet I have discovered that arrangement is not the same as acceptance, that security is not the same as happiness, that having accomplished everything I intended, I remain precisely as isolated as I was before." He turned away from the fire and in the movement, something shifted in his composure. It was as though he had finally permitted the walls to crack, had allowed the interior landscape, all that carefully maintained control, to become visible for the briefest moment. "The watch," she said impulsively. "It is stopped at the moment the scandal broke, is it not?" "Yes," he said simply. "Why do you keep it so? Why do you not have it repaired or discarded or—" "Because," he interrupted, and his voice carried a rawness that transcended the careful modulation of his usual speech. "The moment it stopped was the moment I understood that all the things I had built, all the authority, all the dignity, all the careful preservation of propriety, could be unmade by a single whispered allegation. A woman saw me offer a fellow in Parliament a kindness she deemed inappropriate. She suggested, in the drawing rooms of London, that the kindness indicated impropriety of a nature that would have destroyed me utterly had it gone unchallenged. And I discovered that the only response acceptable to the world was to perform contrition for a sin I did not commit, to damage my reputation so publicly that I could not possibly be hiding anything more shameful. The marriage was part of that performance. A duke who marries a gentlewoman of uncertain position is certainly not a man engaged in illicit affairs. But you did commit to this course," Evelyn said carefully. "You did not yield to the pressure. You chose to marry me." "Yes," he said, and then, after a pause so profound, it seemed to contain the weight of the entire autumn evening, "and now I cannot discern whether I made the choice because it served my interests, or because I could not bear the thought of allowing you to be sacrificed further to a scandal that had no foundation in your actions. I cannot discern, and it troubles me greatly, because I was trained from birth to know the difference between duty and desire, and all of my training seems to have abandoned me entirely." He opened his hand. The watch lay there, ancient and stopped, catching the firelight in its surface. "I brought you this tonight because I wished you to understand something of the interior landscape of this house, but also, and I must beg your forgiveness for my own weakness, because I wished you to know that the time marked on this watch is not all of time. The world does not remain frozen at 4:30. Some of us, against all our training and better judgment, may continue to move forward." He extended his hand, and after a moment in which she seemed to require permission to breathe, Evelyn reached out and took the watch from him. It was warm from his palm, and its weight in her hand felt like responsibility, or perhaps like trust. "I do not know what comes next," the Duke continued. His voice was lower now, more carefully guarded than before. "I do not know how to be anything other than what I was trained to be. But I am beginning to suspect that being trained and being whole are not the same condition." 3 weeks passed with the peculiar rhythm of a marriage that exists more in the arrangement of furniture than in any genuine communion between two persons occupying the same space. The Duke attended Parliament with meticulous regularity. He returned to Ashcombe House each evening and conducted himself with the courtesy one might extend to an esteemed guest rather than a wife. He inquired about her comfort. He ensured that the servants understood his expectations regarding her treatment. He maintained in every observable particular the exterior of a devoted husband. And yet he had not touched her hand since the evening he had given her the pocket watch. Evelyn had begun to recognize that she was living in a state of permanent suspension, neither fully abandoned nor truly received, neither divorced from hope nor permitted its satisfaction. The household had settled around her with the acceptance accorded to any established fact. Mrs. Bell had begun to consult her regarding menus and household management. The servants had ceased to watch her with curiosity and had commenced treating her with the professional respect extended to any duchess. She had, in the most external of senses, become accepted, and she was desperately, achingly lonely. It was Lady Corinne Markham who had finally made her move. Of course it was. Such creatures waited only for weakness to flower before they attacked. The invitation to her salon had been couched in the language of social obligation. Your Grace would honor us with her presence at an intimate gathering of the most select circles. The gathering had proven to be anything but intimate. Rather, it had been a masterpiece of calculated cruelty, a room full of women of influence who had been deliberately positioned to hear and to repeat certain allegations about the Duke's marriage. It had begun with comments so innocent as to be almost invisible. Mrs. Hastings, wife to a member of Parliament, had remarked upon how rapidly His Grace had concluded his courtship. Lady Pettigrew had wondered aloud whether the haste had been necessary, and if so, what circumstances had necessitated it. And then Lady Corinne herself had leaned close and had whispered so that only those she intended to hear could possibly have overheard, that she had heard from a very reliable source that the marriage was a mercy rather than an affair of the heart, that the Duke had taken pity upon a woman whose position had become untenable through no fault of her own, that his kindness was admirable truly, but did it not suggest something rather sad about the state of affairs? A marriage built on pity rather than affection. By the time Evelyn had excused herself from the salon, the insinuations had begun to wound in ways she had not anticipated. She had thought that having been marked by scandal before, she would be armored against further attack. She had thought incorrectly. The wounds were only deeper now because they were sustained not merely by strangers, but by the man who had promised to protect her from precisely this sort of cruelty. She had not intended to confront him. She had planned to maintain her composure, to permit no change in her demeanor, to continue existing within his house as a sort of elegant shadow. But when he came home at 7 that evening, and inquired, as he did with ritualistic consistency, whether she had passed an agreeable day, something in her fractured. "I have passed an agreeable day," she replied. Her voice was perfectly controlled, which somehow made it more dangerous. "I have been to Lady Corinne Markham's salon, where it was suggested by every person of consequence in London society that I have trapped you into marriage through some combination of necessity and desperation, and that your affection for me is precisely the affection one might extend to a drowning victim one has rescued without any expectation of gratitude." The Duke's expression did not alter. He removed his hat and handed it to the footman with meticulous care. He smoothed his coat. He appeared to be performing the ritual of arrival with greater attention than usual, as though each movement required conscious effort to execute. "I am aware," he said finally, "that Lady Corinne has been circulating certain insinuations. Mrs. Bell informed me this afternoon." "Mrs. Bell informed you, and yet you did not see fit to inform me." Her voice had risen despite her intentions to maintain composure. "You did not think to warn me that I would be walking into a room where every woman present had been prepared to attack my reputation? You did not think to equip me with the truth so that I might defend myself?" "There is no defense," he said quietly. The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water. Any denial confirms the accusation. Any explanation suggests shame about the marriage. The only defense is to remain above the fray and permit the tongue to exhaust itself with speculation about what does not concern it. "It concerns me," Evelyn said. Her hands were clenched so tightly that her fingernails pressed crescents into her palms. "It concerns me very much whether the man to whom I am married actually wishes me to be here, or whether I am simply another matter of practical arrangement. It concerns me whether, when he gave me that pocket watch and spoke of moving forward, he meant it, or whether that too was simply another demonstration of courtesy extended to an unfortunate woman." "You have asked the wrong question," the Duke said. He had moved to the window now and was looking out onto the dark street beyond, where rain had begun to fall again. "The question is not whether I wish you to be here, or whether I mean what I say. The question is whether I can afford to permit myself to wish it, whether I can afford to mean what I say in any sense other than the purely practical. I was trained from the moment of my birth to understand that the personal is a luxury I do not possess. That feeling is a form of weakness that threatens not merely my own position, but the security of all those who depend upon my competence." "And is that what I am?" Evelyn asked. "Am I a luxury? Am I a form of weakness?" He turned from the window then, and she saw something in his face that frightened her, not anger but anguish. Raw, unguarded anguish of the sort that men of his station spent lifetimes learning to conceal. "Yes," he said, "you are precisely that. You are the one thing I cannot control, cannot manipulate, cannot defend against through any exercise of intellect or will. You are the one circumstance in which I am not the Duke, and I am utterly terrified by what I might do if I permitted myself to cease being the Duke. I am terrified because I came to you in this house 3 weeks ago and permitted you to see the fractures in my armor, and you have not used that knowledge to wound me, and I do not know how to exist with someone who has the power to destroy me and chooses instead to remain gentle." "Then perhaps," Evelyn said, and her voice had softened now, had become something approaching tender, "you might endeavor to discover how to exist with such a person. Perhaps you might endeavor to trust that the weakness you fear is not a weakness at all, but simply the capacity to be known." It was past midnight when he came to her. Not to the shared suite they maintained for form, but to the small room adjacent to the library, where she had taken refuge in the hours following their confrontation, the room where she sat with the stopped pocket watch resting open in her lap, the watch she had removed from his study with a deliberation that felt almost like theft. The door opened without warning or courtesy, and he stood silhouetted in the doorway, his hair disheveled, his cravat unfastened, his entire composure stripped away like a coat abandoned in haste. There was something almost feral about him in that moment, not dangerous but raw, undone. "I cannot continue this," he said. His voice was rough, as though the words had passed through some interior landscape of jagged stone to reach her. "I cannot continue to maintain this distance. It is destroying me. It is destroying you, and I will not be responsible for that destruction any longer." "Then do not continue," she said simply. She held up the watch, and in the candlelight, the stopped mechanism caught and held the light. "This is not time. This is a monument to fear. But time continues regardless. It always continues." He crossed the room in 3 strides and took the watch from her hands. For a moment he looked at it, truly looked at it, with an intensity that suggested he was seeing it for the first time, or perhaps the last. "I do not know how to do this," he said quietly. "I do not know how to be a husband in any sense other than the legal. I do not know how to permit myself to need or want or desire in ways that extend beyond the practical. I was trained to be invulnerable." "Then permit me to teach you," Evelyn said. She stood, drawing close to him in a movement so deliberate it felt like a question and an answer simultaneously. "I do not require invulnerability. I require only honesty. I require only the willingness to remain present with me, even if presence is difficult." He opened the watch. The mechanism was visible within, intricate and stopped, each gear frozen in its appointed position. And then, with a motion so careful it seemed almost reverent, he turned the small key that wound the mechanism forward. The watch began to tick. It was not a sound one might ordinarily remark upon, the mechanical persistence of a functioning timepiece. Yet in that moment, in that small room adjacent to the library where candles burned low and the autumn rain continued its percussion against the windows, that ticking seemed to contain something momentous. It seemed to contain the sound of a man learning to move forward through time, rather than remaining fixed in the moment when everything had shattered. "I love you," he said. The words emerged with difficulty, as though speaking them required a courage he was not entirely certain he possessed. "I have loved you since the evening you read to me about the botanical gardens at Edinburgh, and I did not realize it was love because I have never been taught how to recognize it. But I know now. I know because the thought of losing you is more terrifying than any scandal, any loss of reputation, any compromise to my position." "Then do not fear losing me," she said, and she reached up and drew him toward her, and their kiss was neither performance nor strategy, but rather the simple meeting of 2 people who had learned through necessity and risk that they were no longer alone. Afterward, they sat together on the small settee, and he held the watch between them, watching its mechanism turn with the mechanical precision that belonged to all functioning timepieces. But there was something different now in how he regarded it. The watch was no longer a monument to the moment everything had fractured. It was a reminder that even fractured things could be made to work again. Even stopped mechanisms could be wound forward. "I must tell you something," he said after some time had passed in companionable silence. "Something about the scandal that precipitated all of this. It was not, as I suggested earlier, merely an allegation of impropriety. It was more calculated than that. Lady Corinne had hoped to force me into marriage with her. When I refused her, she orchestrated the scandal as vengeance. She wished to damage me so thoroughly that I would be forced to seek her good name to restore my own. It was an act of deliberate cruelty. And you chose to marry me instead," Evelyn said quietly, understanding the weight of what he was confessing. "I chose to marry you," he confirmed, "not to protect myself, though that was a consequence, but because I looked at you and saw someone who understood that the world is not divided between the strong and the weak, but between those who have learned to survive and those who have not. Because I recognized in you a kindness that was not weakness, and I wished to know if kindness might also be a form of strength." She took his hand, and together they watched the watch's mechanism turn, marking out the minutes and hours that constituted a future they would build together, not free from difficulty, not free from the pressure of a society that demanded performance, but built on the foundation of honesty that he was learning, incrementally, to permit himself. Outside, the rain began to ease, and inside the small room adjacent to the library, 2 people sat together in the candlelight and understood, with the clarity that belongs only to those who have suffered significantly, that whatever came next would be navigated not as isolated individuals, but as partners in the ongoing work of learning to be human. Morning light filtered through the curtains of the breakfast room with a tentative quality that seemed almost to question whether it was welcome. The servants, having been trained to an almost inhuman level of discretion, maintained their composure as the Duke and Duchess entered together. A simple gesture, the placement of his hand at the small of her back as they passed through the doorway, yet somehow it communicated a transformation in their relationship that no spoken announcement could rival. Mrs. Bell's hands stilled for the briefest moment as she set the china upon the table. It was a pause so minute that only someone watching with particular attention would have noticed it. Evelyn, keenly aware of being observed, saw it nonetheless. The housekeeper's expression shifted imperceptibly from stern neutrality to something approaching approval, though it remained carefully veiled beneath her professional demeanor. "The post has arrived, Your Grace," Mrs. Bell announced, addressing the Duke with the formality that custom required. "There are several matters requiring your attention before Parliament convenes this afternoon." But the Duke, to Evelyn's private astonishment, did not immediately excuse himself to attend to correspondence. Instead, he settled himself at the table and inquired whether she had rested adequately, whether she wished for anything beyond what had been provided, whether she might enjoy visiting the gardens if the rain continued to hold. These were questions, she understood, that communicated something far deeper than mere social courtesy. These were questions that announced to the household, and therefore by the rapid transmission mechanisms of domestic society to all of London, that this was not a marriage of convenience that would proceed to consummate itself in the privacy of darkness and retreat to separateness in the light of day. This was a marriage that the Duke intended to acknowledge publicly, to present as genuine, to defend through the simple act of treating his wife as though her comfort and happiness mattered to him. The implications of this shift were not lost upon the household. By mid-morning, Evelyn could sense the subtle alterations in how the servants conducted themselves in her presence. A footman hastened to open doors that had previously been left for her to navigate independently. A housemaid, who had previously maintained a careful distance, asked whether Her Grace required anything additional for her morning toilet. The cook requested an audience to discuss whether Her Grace had preferences regarding the dinner preparations. It was a small revolution, conducted entirely in the language of propriety and service, yet it communicated clearly. The Duchess was no longer an uncertain addition to the household, but a woman whose position was secure, whose status was unquestionable, whose presence had been endorsed by the man who controlled every circumstance within those walls. By the afternoon, however, the delicate architecture of their newfound peace had begun to develop cracks. A caller had come to the door in the form of Lady Corinne Markham herself, dressed in an ensemble of such calculated elegance that it seemed almost a weapon. She had requested an audience with the Duke, and when informed that His Grace was at Parliament, she had asked to speak with the Duchess instead. It was a request that Mrs. Bell had attempted to deflect, but Evelyn, reading the housekeeper's carefully neutral expression, understood that declining might be interpreted as cowardice. The drawing room was arranged precisely as always, the furniture positioned to suggest both comfort and distance, the light from the windows controlled by curtains of pale blue damask, the fireplace radiating warmth that somehow did not extend to the emotional temperature of the space. Lady Corinne settled herself upon a chair as though she were the hostess and Evelyn the guest, her violet silk rustling with an audible precision. "I have come," Lady Corinne began, "to apologize for certain remarks that may have been circulated following my salon." She smiled, and the expression was so perfectly composed that it took a moment to recognize it as a weapon rather than an expression of genuine contrition. "I fear I was careless with the truth. I suggested that your marriage was based upon His Grace's charity rather than his affection, and I have since come to understand that such a suggestion was unworthy of my position." "I appreciate your clarification," Evelyn replied carefully. The woman was clearly attempting something, some form of manipulation disguised as apology, yet the precise nature of her intent remained obscured. "The truth," Lady Corinne continued, leaning slightly forward in a gesture of false confidence, "is far more interesting than mere charity, is it not? The truth is that His Grace married you to silence a far more devastating scandal than anyone has dared to discuss publicly. A scandal that involves not merely alleged impropriety, but actual proof of conduct that would make even the most indulgent drawing room withdraw their acceptance." Evelyn's heart had begun to beat with an irregular rhythm, yet she maintained her composure. I do not believe you possess any information of that nature. Do I not? Lady Corinne withdrew a letter from her reticule, a letter sealed with the Ashcombe crest, the handwriting unmistakably the Duke's. I have in my possession correspondence that suggests His Grace has engaged in financial arrangements with certain parties that would be viewed as inappropriate. Arrangements that would require explanation to both Parliament and the family solicitor. Arrangements that might jeopardize his position entirely, were they to become public knowledge. You are attempting to blackmail the Duke, Evelyn said quietly. I am attempting, Lady Corinne corrected, to remind him that certain alliances are more valuable than certain marriages. I am suggesting that were he to gracefully distance himself from his current wife, were he to acknowledge that the marriage was a temporary expedience that has served its purpose, a great many complications might resolve themselves. I'm offering him an opportunity to preserve both his reputation and his position. And if he refuses? Evelyn asked, though she already understood the answer. Then these letters, and several others of equal interest, will find their way to the offices of the Times, to Parliament, to every drawing-room in London that matters. The damage will be comprehensive. The consequences will be irreversible. Evelyn rose to her feet. Her hands were steady, which seemed to her remarkable, given the way her interior landscape had begun to tremble. I believe you have said everything you have come to say, Lady Corinne. I suggest you remove yourself from this house before I am forced to have you removed. Such courage, Lady Corinne murmured, gathering her belongings with deliberate slowness. Pity that it will serve you so little when the scandal breaks, but I do commend you for maintaining your composure. After Lady Corinne had departed, Evelyn remained standing in the drawing-room, staring at nothing in particular, her mind engaged in a calculation more complex than any she had previously been required to perform. The Duke had married her knowing that scandal might attend him. She had understood that to be the case, but this, a threat to his political position, to his reputation in Parliament itself, this was something beyond the social gossip that had characterized the previous weeks. She understood now what he had been protected from by his rigid control, his careful distance, his refusal to permit himself to feel. Love made one vulnerable. It made one capable of being wounded in ways that armor could not deflect. And she had opened herself to precisely that sort of wounding when she had permitted him to come to her in the darkness, when she had chosen to believe in the possibility of happiness. Now that possibility was threatened. And she had no means of defending it, except through an honesty that might destroy everything they had begun to build. The Duke did not return home until nearly 8 o'clock that evening. Evelyn had spent the preceding hours in a state of suspended uncertainty, attempting to occupy her time with reading, with correspondence, with any pursuit sufficiently engaging to prevent her mind from circling repeatedly around the threat that Lady Corinne had articulated. She had not informed Mrs. Bell of the visitor. She had not sent word to Parliament requesting his early return. She had simply waited, and the waiting had become increasingly intolerable. When he did finally arrive, she knew immediately, from the particular rigidity of his posture, from the way his eyes scanned the drawing-room as though searching for some indication of disturbance, that he was already aware something had transpired. Mrs. Bell informs me that Lady Corinne called this afternoon, he said without preamble. His voice carried the particular coldness that emerged when he was forcing emotion to retreat behind layers of control. What did she want? Evelyn recounted the conversation with as much precision as she could manage. She watched his expression shift, first to calculation, then to something approaching anger, and finally to a weariness so profound that it seemed to age him before her eyes. The letters she described do not exist, he said, once she had finished. Or rather, they exist, but they do not contain what she has suggested. Several years ago, I made certain investments on behalf of widows in my household who had no other means of preserving their security. Those investments were conducted through intermediaries specifically to protect their privacy and their dignity. The arrangements were entirely legal, entirely appropriate, and entirely designed to ensure that women without resources would not be rendered destitute by circumstance. Then you have nothing to fear from her threats, Evelyn said, though she understood that this was a naive assessment even as she made it. On the contrary, he replied, I have everything to fear. The truth of those arrangements would be interpreted as evidence of impropriety by those with sufficient malice and sufficient ignorance. It would be weaponized against me by political rivals. It would be used to question my judgment, my character, my fitness to maintain my position. The scandal would be comprehensive, and the defense would be nearly impossible. It was at this moment that the Dowager Countess Hartwick appeared in the doorway, having apparently been attending to some matter in the adjoining room, and overheard the latter portions of their conversation. She was dressed in black bombazine as always, her hair arranged with the precision of long habit, her expression one of stern attention. "I have heard quite enough," the Dowager said briskly. She entered the drawing-room with the confidence of a woman who had not requested permission to do so, and who did not anticipate receiving it. "Lady Corinne Markham has been a plague upon civilized society for the better part of a decade. She destroyed a promising young barrister through precisely these sorts of manipulations. She ruined the engagement of Lord Ashworth's niece through similar threats. She is not a woman to be reasoned with, but rather a woman to be confronted with the full force of collective society." "And how precisely do you suggest I accomplish that, Aunt?" the Duke inquired. There was a note in his voice suggesting he was not entirely confident in her ability to provide wisdom, yet was willing to entertain the possibility. "You do not defend yourself," the Dowager replied with the certainty of one who had lived through considerably more social warfare than her nephew. "You do not engage with her threats. Instead, you ensure that every person of consequence in London understands that Lady Corinne possesses these letters through theft and blackmail, and that your character is sufficiently assured that you require no defense. You present your marriage as a love match of the first order. You demonstrate, through every public gesture and every private behavior, that this woman has no power to disturb your peace." "You are suggesting I advertise my personal life," the Duke said quietly. "I am suggesting you make your marriage public in a way that transforms it from a practical arrangement into an undeniable fact of your emotional life," the Dowager corrected. "I have spent 3 weeks observing you both, and I have come to understand that something genuine has transpired between you, something that makes the scandal of your union seem not merely acceptable, but romantic. Use that. Defend yourself with it." Evelyn watched this exchange with a growing recognition of the wisdom being articulated. The Dowager was suggesting in her austere manner precisely what both she and the Duke most feared: the complete abandonment of their protective walls, the public acknowledgement of their vulnerability, the deliberate choice to permit their love to be observed and evaluated and judged by those they had previously maintained at a distance. "It is a considerable risk," the Duke said finally. "Yes," the Dowager agreed. "It is, but it is a risk with potential for tremendous reward. You have been taught to believe that showing weakness destroys authority. I have lived long enough to understand that there is no authority more absolute than that derived from a man who has chosen to love authentically despite the risk of injury. Lady Corinne's power derives entirely from her belief that you will prioritize your reputation over your heart. Prove her wrong." After the Dowager had departed, leaving behind her an atmosphere of austere wisdom that seemed to have shifted something fundamental in the room, the Duke turned to Evelyn. "My aunt has suggested something rather impossible," he said. "She has suggested that I publicly declare my love for you at Lady Pemberton's ball next week. That I dance with you when I have previously maintained the cold distance of a purely practical husband. That I look at you the way I actually feel, rather than the way society prescribes I should feel. Would you wish to do so?" Evelyn asked carefully. "I would wish," he said slowly, "to do nothing else. But wishes and wisdom do not often align, and I fear that to permit myself to desire it is to permit myself to be wounded if the plan fails." "Then perhaps," Evelyn said quietly, "you might permit yourself to be wounded. Perhaps that is precisely what your aunt intended you to understand." The ballroom at Pemberton House was arranged precisely as it should be. Crystal chandeliers suspended from a ceiling painted with the allegory of Athena, mirrors positioned to multiply the light until the room seemed to contain more space than geography would suggest, musicians arranged in a gallery above the floor itself, their instruments creating a musical backdrop that suggested both refinement and festivity. The gathering was amongst the most exclusive of the season, limited to those whose lineage or fortune or both entitled them to attendance. Evelyn had been dressed by her lady's maid with meticulous care. Her gown was silk, the colour of champagne, adorned with the subtlest of silver threads that caught the candlelight as she moved. Her hair had been arranged with considerable artistry, loosely curled and pinned with a single ornament of pearl and diamond. She looked, by any reasonable assessment, exactly as a duchess should look, elegant, restrained, appropriate, and she was terrified in a way that no amount of external composure could fully conceal. The Duke was waiting in the entrance hall when she descended the staircase. He wore his formal dress with the precision that characterized all his movements, charcoal coat impeccably tailored, his shirt front pristine, his cravat tied with the exactitude of long practice. But his eyes, when they met hers, contained something that no amount of formal attire could control, a vulnerability so profound that it seemed to ask a question to which he already feared the answer. "You are extraordinary," he said simply. It was not the compliment of a man executing social obligation. It was a statement delivered with the weight of genuine feeling. "I am terrified," she replied with equal simplicity. "Yes," he said, "so am I." The ballroom, when they entered it, seemed to absorb their presence with a pause so minute that only those watching with particular attention would have perceived it. Yet many were watching. Word had clearly circulated throughout society that the Duke of Ashcombe intended to present himself and his wife at Lady Pemberton's gathering. Speculation had been rife. Theories had been exchanged. The ton had positioned itself to observe. The Duke led her to the position designated for the opening dance. As the musicians began a waltz, a piece of considerable elegance that seemed designed for the expression of emotion, he placed his hand at her waist with a deliberateness that suggested this was not the casual gesture of a dance partner, but rather a public declaration of intimacy. And then they danced. It was not a dance executed with the mechanical precision that characterized most ballroom performances. It was a dance that communicated, through every movement and every gesture, that the space between them contained not propriety, but passion. He looked at her, not with the cold regard of a man fulfilling social obligation, but with the intensity of a man who had chosen to permit himself to be vulnerable. His hand at her waist was firm, possessive, protective. His other hand held hers, as though she might otherwise slip away into the crowd and be lost to him forever. Evelyn saw it in the faces of the onlookers as they circled the ballroom. Shock, reassessment, a gradual shift in understanding. This was not a marriage of convenience. This was not a practical arrangement that had been elevated to the status of respectability. This was a marriage entered into with the full force of genuine feeling, and the man performing this declaration was the Duke of Ashcombe, who was known throughout London society for his controlled composure and his absolute refusal to permit his personal feelings to intersect with his public persona. When the waltz concluded, there was a moment of silence that seemed to extend for an eternity before applause erupted, not the polite, measured applause that typically concluded a dance, but rather genuine appreciation, approval, recognition of something that transcended ordinary social performance. Lady Corinne Markham stood at the periphery of the ballroom, her expression transformed into something approaching fury. Evelyn saw her withdraw, saw her attempt to position herself in conversation with several of society's most influential women, saw the subtle way they turned from her, not openly, not in a manner that would constitute a scene, but with a finality that communicated clearly that her social standing had shifted. By the end of the evening, word had begun to circulate that Lady Corinne had made certain threats against the Duke, and that these threats had been constructed from fabricated letters and exaggerated insinuations. The story gathered momentum with the efficiency that only scandal-hungry society can achieve. The woman who had previously been courted for her influence was gradually, inexorably, excluded. When they returned home in the early hours of the morning, the Duke took Evelyn's hand in his as they climbed the staircase to their private rooms. "Your aunt was right," Evelyn said quietly. "Showing weakness did not destroy your authority. It transformed it into something far more powerful." "My aunt was right about a great many things," he replied, "but she was most correct about this, that the greatest authority a man can possess is the authority derived from choosing to love authentically. Thank you for permitting me to make that choice. Thank you for standing with me when the cost of honesty seemed incalculable." In the privacy of their chambers, they held one another in the candlelight, and the Duke removed the pocket watch from where he kept it always upon his person. The watch that had been stopped was now a constant reminder of time's persistence, of the possibility of redemption, of the certainty that even fractured things could be restored. The weeks that followed Lady Pemberton's ball were characterized by a gradual transformation of society's regard for the Duke and Duchess. The scandal that had threatened them both, Lady Corinne's fabricated threats, the whispered suggestions about impropriety, dissolved with the remarkable efficiency of falsehoods when confronted with authentic feeling. Parliament, which might have viewed the Duke's situation with suspicion, instead witnessed a man whose authority seemed paradoxically enhanced by his public acknowledgement of genuine emotion. His voting record became stronger, his political alliances solidified. The very transparency that might have been expected to create vulnerability instead created an unshakable credibility. But more significant than society's reassessment was the transformation of the household itself. Mrs. Bell's stern countenance had softened into something approaching warmth when she observed the Duke and Duchess together. The servants no longer performed their duties as though executing prescribed ritual, but rather as though serving a household that had become genuinely unified in its purpose. Even the Dowager Countess Hartwick, after spending an additional month at Ashcombe House, had begun to speak of remaining through the winter, a departure from her previous statements about the inconvenience of prolonged visits. It was the Dowager who suggested, one cold November afternoon, that the Duke might consider inviting certain members of Parliament to a house party at Ashcombe's country estate. It was the Dowager who suggested, with her characteristic directness, that the Duchess might be instrumental in ensuring such an event proved both socially successful and politically advantageous. "Your wife," the Dowager had stated bluntly, "is a woman of considerable intelligence and discretion. She should not be relegated to the background while you conduct the serious business of power. Instead, she should be permitted to understand the mechanisms of influence and to participate in their operation. A woman who has survived scandal as she has survived it is precisely the sort of woman who understands nuance and consequence." The house party, which took place in the first week of December, transformed Ashcombe's country estate into something between a salon and a strategy chamber. Members of Parliament mingled with their wives. Influential members of society encountered one another in carefully arranged circumstances, and throughout it all, the Duchess moved with a grace that reflected both her education and her hard-won understanding of how to navigate spaces where power intersected with propriety. One evening, as a smaller gathering assembled in the library after dinner, the Duke observed his wife in conversation with Lord Wetherby, one of Parliament's most influential members. She was discussing the complexities of agricultural reform with a precision that suggested genuine understanding rather than the performance of interest. Lord Wetherby was leaning toward her with the absorbed attention of a man whose assumptions were being challenged in ways that he found intellectually stimulating. Later, when they had retired to their private chambers, the Duke took her hand in his. "You have accomplished something remarkable," he said quietly. "You have transformed from a woman whom society viewed as unfortunate circumstance into a woman whom society now views as an asset of considerable value. More importantly, you have done so without sacrificing any of the integrity that makes you remarkable in the first place." "I have done nothing," Evelyn replied, "except cease to hide, cease to apologize for existing, cease to accept the definition that others have attempted to impose upon me. The rest has simply followed from that refusal. And I," the Duke said, "have learned something equally valuable. I have learned that control purchased through emotional distance is not actually control at all. It is merely the illusion of control. True authority derives from the willingness to be known, to be vulnerable, to permit oneself to be touched by another person's truth." He withdrew the pocket watch from his pocket and opened it. The mechanism continued its patient ticking, marking the passage of time, measuring the moments that comprised a life lived in genuine connection rather than in the fortress of carefully maintained distance. "This watch," he said, "will no longer mark the moment when everything fractured. It will instead mark every moment we continue forward together, every moment of this new architecture we are building." "Then perhaps," Evelyn suggested, "you might consider winding it with the same care you once reserved for the walls you maintained. Perhaps you might allow it to become simply a watch rather than a monument to fear." He did precisely that. The watch, which had been kept always visible as a reminder of what had been lost, was placed upon the mantelpiece in their private sitting room, no longer a burden to be carried, but rather a simple object that had ceased to require meaning beyond its mechanical function. In the drawing room below, the sounds of piano music and conversation continued. The Dowager Countess was engaged in a game of chess with Lord Wetherby. The other guests were occupied with the pursuits that belonged to such gatherings, but in the private chambers above, the Duke and Duchess sat together in the candlelight, and there was no longer any distance between them that required bridging. The space they occupied together had become simply and completely their own. December had transformed Ashcombe's country estate into something approaching a winter wonderland. The grounds, which had been maintained with meticulous precision by generations of groundskeepers, seemed to soften under the accumulation of frost and snow. The lake, which had reflected the autumn sky with austere clarity, had begun its transformation into solid ice, and within the house fires burned continuously, transforming the stone corridors into spaces of warmth and gathering. It was in the library, on a morning when snow fell steadily beyond the windows, and the household moved with the particular rhythm of December contentment, that the Dowager Countess approached Evelyn with something she had never previously offered, an expression of genuine approval. "I came to Ashcombe House with preconceived notions," the Dowager stated without preamble, "and I have been proven wrong. That is a rare experience at my age, and I do not appreciate it being frittered away without acknowledgement. You have not destroyed my nephew. On the contrary, you have restored him to a version of himself that I believe he might have become had he not been constrained by generations of instruction in emotional control." "I have done only what was necessary," Evelyn replied carefully. "No," the Dowager corrected with characteristic bluntness. "You have done what was difficult. You have remained present with him through his discomfort with authenticity. You have not permitted him to retreat into the safety of distance. That is not only what was necessary, that is love in its most demanding form." That evening, the Duke requested that Evelyn join him in his study. She had begun to recognize that his study, which had once been a place of solitude and isolation, had become a space where he now welcomed her presence, where he consulted her on matters of estate management, where he simply existed in companionship, rather than in the silence that had previously characterized such spaces. What she found, however, was not the ordinary arrangement of his study, but rather something that suggested considerable preparation. The fireplace burned with unusual brightness. The desk, which was typically arrayed with correspondence and estate documents, had been cleared entirely, except for a single object, a leather box of considerable age, bearing the Ashcombe crest in worn silver. "I have been holding something that belongs, I believe, to you," the Duke said quietly. "Or rather, that should belong to you, if you are willing to accept it." He opened the box to reveal not jewels, though jewels were present, but rather something far more significant, a series of letters written in what appeared to be the handwriting of various women who had preceded Evelyn in the household. Letters expressing gratitude, affection, and recognition of kindness, and beneath them, a note in the Duke's handwriting, dated to the morning after their wedding night. "To the woman who has shown me that tenderness is not weakness, but rather the highest form of strength. To the woman who has loved me despite my defenses, despite my fear, despite my absolute certainty that I was incapable of being loved, I offer this." The letters of women who have found sanctuary in this household through the simple practice of being treated with dignity and care. I offer this as evidence that the capacity for genuine feeling that I was taught to suppress was always present, only awaiting permission to emerge. I offer this as a vow that I will spend the remainder of my life learning to be the man you have already recognized in me. Evelyn took the letter with hands that trembled, despite her intention to maintain composure. When she looked up from it, she found the Duke on one knee before her, not in theatrical fashion, but with a simple dignity that characterized all his movements. "I am offering you," he said, "not as an act of legal necessity, but as an act of genuine choosing, the whole of my life. Not merely my title, not merely my name, not merely the security that position provides, but the interior landscape that has become gradually known to you, the man who exists beneath the armor of control, the man who was terrified of precisely what he has now discovered to be his salvation." He withdrew from his pocket not a ring, for she already wore one, but rather the pocket watch, the watch that had been stopped, that he had wound forward in the small room adjacent to the library that had become the symbol of their journey from isolation to connection. "This watch," he said, "will continue to mark the passage of time, but it will no longer mark what was broken. It will mark what we continue to build together, every moment of this life that we will share, every instance in which I chose, despite my training, despite my fear, to permit myself to be known by you." He placed the watch in her hand, and she closed her fingers around it, feeling the persistent ticking that continued against her palm. "I love you," she said simply. "I have loved you from the moment you permitted yourself to be vulnerable with me. I will continue to love you through whatever trials come. I will remain present with you as you remain present with me." When the household gathered that evening for dinner, Mrs. Bell had prepared a meal of considerable celebration. The Dowager Countess smiled, actually smiled with genuine warmth, when she observed the couple enter together. The servants, understanding through the mysterious mechanisms by which such information circulates, executed their duties with a special care that suggested recognition of something momentous having transpired. On the mantelpiece in the drawing room, the pocket watch sat in a place of honor. It was no longer a monument to fear or fracture, but rather a simple marker of time's persistence, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed walls could be unmade by the willingness to be honest about what lay behind them. And in the candlelight of Ashcombe House, as December snow continued to fall upon London streets and the frost deepened upon the window panes, two people sat together in the certainty that they had found, against all probability and all prior conviction that such a thing was impossible, exactly what they had not known they were searching for, an honest reflection of their own capacity to love and be loved in return. The transition from December into January marked a subtle but unmistakable shift in the character of Ashcombe House. The season of celebration had given way to the season of reflection, and with it came a quieter form of intimacy, one characterized not by grand gestures or public declarations, but rather by the accumulated small moments that comprised a life lived in genuine partnership. The Dowager Countess had elected to remain through the winter months, an announcement that had surprised no one who understood the particular satisfaction she derived from observing the successful functioning of a household that had previously operated with mechanical precision rather than genuine warmth. She had begun to interfere in household matters with her characteristic directness, suggesting minor alterations to the arrangement of furniture, recommending particular wines from the cellar, and most unexpectedly, requesting that Evelyn assist her in organizing a significant charitable initiative aimed at providing assistance to widows and orphaned children. "Your husband's discretionary investments on behalf of women in desperate circumstances are admirable but insufficient," the Dowager had announced one morning as she and Evelyn reviewed account ledgers in the study. "What is required is a systematic approach, one that does not rely upon the patronage of individual men, but rather upon the establishment of structures that protect women from the necessity of such patronage in the first place." It was an idea that had seized Evelyn's imagination immediately. She had spent weeks researching the legal mechanisms by which charitable organizations might be established, consulting with solicitors, developing a framework that would permit the protection of vulnerable women without rendering them objects of pity. The work had transformed from a charitable endeavor into something approaching an intellectual passion, a pursuit that permitted her to direct her considerable abilities toward a purpose that extended beyond the maintenance of a household. The Duke had observed this transformation with a particular intensity that suggested something beyond mere approval. One evening, as they sat together in the library before the fire, he had taken her hand and traced the calluses that had begun to develop on her fingertips, evidence of the countless hours she had spent writing correspondence, organizing documentation, planning the infrastructure of their charitable organization. "You have discovered your purpose," he had said quietly. "I had not realized until I witnessed you engaged in this work that I had perhaps unknowingly constrained yours through the simple act of requiring your attention for the management of our household." "You have done no such thing," Evelyn had replied. "Rather, you have provided the security through which such purpose becomes possible. A woman without the protection of a title, a name, and the resources of an established household cannot afford to direct her attention toward charitable work. You have provided me the very freedom that permits this endeavor. Nevertheless," the Duke had continued, "I am beginning to understand that the greatest gift I can offer you is not security, but rather the permission to be fully yourself. Not the constrained version of myself that I maintained before knowing you, but the possibility of expansion, of becoming something larger than the role prescribed to me by birth and obligation." It was during a particularly cold morning in mid-January that a visitor had arrived whose presence shifted the careful equilibrium they had established. The visitor was the Duke's younger brother, a man who had apparently been residing abroad for the better part of a decade, and whose return to England had coincided with the stabilization of the Duke's domestic arrangements. Charles Vane possessed the dark coloring of his elder brother, but lacked entirely the careful restraint that characterized Benedict's deportment. He was effusive where his brother was measured, spontaneous where his brother was deliberate, and possessed of a charm that seemed to require no effort whatsoever to exercise. "My God, brother," Charles had exclaimed upon his arrival, "you have transformed yourself entirely. You have actually married for something approaching love, or at the very least for something more complex than mere political calculation. I confess I did not believe you capable of such a thing." The Duke had received his brother with the courtesy custom required, but there was something in the precise way he had positioned himself between Charles and Evelyn that suggested a protective instinct, an understanding that the casual manner of his brother's observations might mask something more calculating. "You have been abroad for an extended period," the Duke had replied carefully. "Matters at Ashcombe have evolved considerably in your absence." Charles had remained at Ashcombe for a period of 3 days, during which time his behavior had gradually revealed itself to be less casual charm and more deliberate assessment. He had inquired about the state of the estate finances. He had asked pointed questions regarding the Duke's parliamentary involvement. He had, with what appeared to be unconscious rudeness, suggested to Evelyn that the household would benefit from the presence of a woman whose understanding of aristocratic traditions extended deeper than the utilitarian efficiency she had instituted. On the evening of his departure, the Duke had requested a private interview with his brother in the study. Evelyn had been reading before the fire in the drawing room when she heard raised voices emanating from behind the closed door, something she had never previously witnessed at Ashcombe House, where emotional containment was maintained with almost religious rigor. When the Duke had finally emerged, there was something in his expression suggesting that a boundary had been established and defended. He had taken her hand without speaking and had led her to their private chambers, where he had held her without explanation, as though her physical presence provided some form of reassurance he required. "My brother," he had finally said, "has suggested that our marriage is an impediment to my political advancement. He has suggested that a wife who is engaged in charitable work rather than the traditional social functions of a duchess is a liability rather than an asset. He has suggested that I have allowed sentiment to compromise my judgment." "And what have you replied?" Evelyn had asked, though she believed she already understood. "I have replied," the Duke had said quietly, "that my judgment has never been clearer than it is now. That your presence in my life has not compromised my effectiveness, but rather enhanced it by providing me with motivation beyond the abstract preservation of power. That the life we are constructing together is precisely the life I wish to live, regardless of whether it conforms to my brother's expectations or society's prescriptions." He had withdrawn the pocket watch and opened it, watching the mechanism continue its patient progression. "My brother views this marriage as a deviation from the proper course, but I have come to understand that the proper course is precisely what I rejected when I chose you. The proper course would have been isolation, distance, the preservation of power through the maintenance of emotional detachment. Instead, I have chosen presence. I have chosen connection. I have chosen you, and I would make that choice again, regardless of any opposition." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late January, delivered by a courier who bore the seal of the House of Commons and whose demeanour suggested the matter was of considerable importance. The Duke was in the study when the correspondence arrived, but Mrs. Bell, exercising the judgment she had refined across decades of service, brought it directly to Evelyn, rather than interrupting what appeared to be a period of intensive work. Evelyn recognized the significance of the seal and carried it to the study, where she found her husband reviewing legislation regarding agricultural reform. She placed the letter before him and watched as his expression shifted through several gradations of attention before settling upon something approximating satisfaction. "It appears," he said after reading the contents, "that my colleagues in Parliament have taken note of the charitable organization we are establishing. They are requesting that I present before a committee regarding the mechanisms by which such organizations might be expanded across the nation. They are requesting specifically that you present alongside me." "But I am a woman," Evelyn had said quietly. "Parliament does not typically receive testimony from women." "No," the Duke had replied, "it does not, which is precisely why presenting you before them will constitute a revolutionary act. You have developed something of intellectual and social significance. You have constructed a framework through which vulnerable women might be protected without rendering them objects of charity. That work deserves to be heard, regardless of the gender of the person who executed it." The preparation for the parliamentary presentation had occupied nearly 3 weeks of intensive labor. The Duke had worked with Evelyn to refine the arguments, to anticipate objections, to construct a presentation that would communicate both the moral imperative and the practical efficiency of their proposed system. The Dowager Countess had contributed her considerable knowledge of legal structures. Even Mrs. Bell had offered suggestions regarding the implementation of protective measures within household contexts. On the day of the presentation, Evelyn had dressed in her finest gown, deep blue silk with silver threading, and had entered Parliament for the first time in her life. She had been acutely aware of the extraordinary nature of her presence. the way the assembled members had turned to regard her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism that suggested they had not previously encountered a woman presenting substantive testimony regarding matters of social policy. The Duke had spoken first, articulating the framework of their proposed system with the clarity and precision that his parliamentary colleagues had come to recognize and respect. Then, as he had stepped aside, she had been called to present her own observations. Evelyn had stood before the assembled members of Parliament, hundreds of them, their eyes upon her with varying degrees of attention, and had described with meticulous detail the circumstances that had driven her to develop their charitable framework. She had spoken of her own precarious situation, of her understanding of how reputation functioned as currency for women, of the mechanisms by which vulnerable women might be systematically protected rather than subject to the arbitrary patronage of individuals. She had spoken for 45 minutes, and throughout that time she had been aware of a particular quality of attention emanating from the member occupying the seat designated for the Duke. She had been aware that he was not merely listening, but rather bearing witness to her courage, to her intelligence, to the transformation she had undergone from a woman defined by circumstance into a woman defining her own purpose. When she had completed her testimony and returned to the observers' gallery, where the Duke sat waiting, he had reached for her hand and had held it with a pressure that communicated more clearly than any words the depth of his regard. The vote on the proposal had been scheduled for the following week. In the interim, the London newspapers had begun to circulate stories regarding the unprecedented presentation, some treating it with the skepticism that might attach to any innovation, others with genuine interest in the substantive proposals Evelyn had articulated. But most significantly, society had begun to shift its perception of the Duchess of Ashcombe. She was no longer viewed simply as the woman the Duke had married to remedy a scandal. She was beginning to be regarded as a woman of intellectual substance, a woman whose ideas possessed merit regardless of her gender, a woman who had utilized the protection of her position not for personal aggrandizement, but for the alleviation of suffering. On the evening following the vote, which had passed with a margin sufficiently substantial to surprise even the most optimistic of its proponents, the Duke had taken Evelyn to the rooftop garden of Ashcombe House, a space that few inhabitants of the household ever visited, but which the Duke had apparently claimed for his own purposes years previously. "When I was a boy," he had said, standing beside her as they looked out over the snow-covered expanse of London, "I came to this place when I wished to escape the demands of my position. I came here to be alone, to be free from the necessity of performing propriety. Now I find that I wish to share this space with you. I wish for you to understand that the man who sought refuge from the world is the same man who now chooses to stand beside you, before the entire nation, and defend your right to be heard." "And are you still the man who requires refuge?" she had asked carefully. "No," he had replied, "I am not, because I have discovered that refuge is not solitude, but rather connection. Refuge is the presence of another person who knows you fully and chooses to remain present nonetheless." February brought with it a particular cruelty of weather, snow falling sporadically, then melting, then freezing again into treacherous sheets of ice that made the streets of London navigable only for those possessed of considerable caution. It was during this season of uncertainty that the scandal, which Evelyn had believed to be securely buried beneath the weight of the Duke's public declarations and the consolidation of their charitable work, resurfaced with unexpected force. The mechanism of its resurrection was precisely as malicious as the original scandal had been. Lady Corinne Markham, whose social position had been severely compromised following her attempted blackmail, had apparently determined that destruction through direct threat had failed, and had therefore shifted to the subtler but no less damaging strategy of rumour and insinuation. She had begun to circulate amongst the drawing rooms of London's most influential hostesses suggestions that the Duke's charitable organisation was not actually driven by principle, but rather by a desire to shield his wife from investigation into her own precarious financial circumstances prior to her marriage. She had insinuated that Evelyn's parliamentary testimony had been coached by the Duke, that she was incapable of formulating such sophisticated arguments independently, that her intellectual pretensions were precisely that, pretensions designed to obscure her actual nature as a woman of limited education who had elevated herself through exploitation of a man's emotional weakness. The rumours had reached Ashcombe House through the particular channels by which such information always circulates: a carefully casual remark from a distant cousin, a concerned query from the dowager regarding what might have prompted such discussion, a subtle withdrawal of invitations from hostesses who had previously been enthusiastically engaged in their social calendar. The Duke had received the reports with a composure that initially Evelyn had interpreted as indifference, but which she had gradually come to recognize as the careful management of anger. His jaw had tightened imperceptibly, his hands had remained steady, but something in the way he held them suggested an effort at restraint. His eyes had acquired a coldness that suggested the return of the emotional fortress she had believed him to have dismantled entirely. "You are angry," she had observed one evening as they prepared for dinner. "Yes," he had replied without equivocation. "I am angry because I had permitted myself to believe that we had moved beyond this. I had permitted myself to believe that our declarations, our work, our public presence together would be sufficient to silence the voices of those who wish to diminish you through insinuation and malice. I find that my belief was naive. Or perhaps," Evelyn had suggested carefully, "it was simply premature. Perhaps the work of defending oneself against malice is never truly completed. Perhaps one can only choose, repeatedly, to stand firm against it." It was at this moment that the Dowager Countess had intervened with a directness that suggested she had been waiting for the appropriate moment to do so. She had summoned a gathering, nothing so grand as a ball, but rather an intimate dinner, attended by the most influential women in London society. She had deliberately positioned these women where they would be observed, where their attendance at the gathering would be noted and reported in the society columns, where their public endorsement of the Duchess would constitute a statement impossible to ignore. She had, moreover, ensured that her own authority was placed entirely behind Evelyn. During the dinner, in remarks that had been designed to be overheard and circulated, the Dowager had spoken with pride regarding Evelyn's parliamentary testimony, her intellectual acuity, her generation of substantive ideas that would alter the lives of vulnerable women for generations to come. She had spoken with the certainty of someone whose position was so established that no challenge to her assessment could succeed. By the conclusion of the evening, the tide had shifted perceptibly. The women who had been prepared to doubt Evelyn had instead encountered her in circumstances that suggested she possessed allies of considerable power. They had observed the Dowager's genuine regard, the Duke's obvious pride, the clear indicators that this was not a woman to be dismissed through insinuation. Lady Corinne's attempts to poison the well had backfired with catastrophic precision. Within days, the rumours had reversed themselves. Now it was being whispered that Lady Corinne had attempted to defame the Duchess through jealousy, that her accusations were rooted in her own social diminishment, that her credibility had been fundamentally compromised. On the evening following the dinner, the Duke had found Evelyn in the library and had taken her hand with a particular tenderness that suggested something had shifted within him. "I have been contemplating what the Dowager accomplished this evening," he had said. "She has demonstrated something that I have been struggling to understand, that defense against malice is not primarily an individual matter, but rather a collective one, that standing together with those who support us transforms insinuation into noise rather than truth, that the power of alliance is precisely what I was taught to believe was weakness." "Perhaps," Evelyn had suggested, "you were taught to believe many things that were not true. Perhaps the entire system within which you were trained was constructed around a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes genuine strength." "Yes," he had agreed. "I believe I am beginning to recognize that." March arrived with a tentative quality of renewal, the first genuine warmth returning to the air, the gardens beginning to show evidence of growth beneath the earth, the world emerging from winter's imprisonment as though it had been held in suspension and was now being released. The transformation was reflected within Ashcombe House as well, where a sense of consolidation had replaced the defensiveness that had characterized the months of scandal and vindication. The charitable organization had begun to expand beyond London into the provinces. Branches had been established in Manchester, Birmingham and Liverpool, each coordinated through correspondence that Evelyn managed with meticulous attention, each administered by women whom she had personally selected for their integrity and their understanding of the particular circumstances of vulnerable women in their respective regions. The Duke had taken to reviewing Evelyn's correspondence with evident interest, asking questions, offering suggestions, gradually involving himself in what had become not merely his wife's project, but rather a shared endeavour that reflected their combined commitment to systemic improvement. The pocket watch, which had once been a monument to fracture, had been repositioned in their private sitting room, no longer a burden to be carried, but rather a simple ornament that served as reminder of the journey they had undertaken together. It was during this period of relative calm that the Duke had begun to speak of establishing a household in town, not to replace Ashcombe House, but to augment it, providing a base from which Evelyn might more easily coordinate her expanding charitable work and from which the Duke might execute his parliamentary responsibilities without the constant transit between London and the country estate. "I have been contemplating what form our future might take," he had said one morning as they rode in the park, the spring air carrying hints of growing things, the trees showing the first tentative emergence of new leaves. "I have concluded that the life we have constructed, the balance between private devotion and public purpose, is precisely the life I wish to continue indefinitely. I wish to secure that life in every particular." "How do you propose to do so?" she had asked, though she had believed she understood his intent. "I propose," he had replied, "to ensure that our charitable organization is established not merely as the project of the current Duke and Duchess, but rather as an institution that will persist regardless of circumstance. I propose to place it under the governance of a board composed of women of influence and integrity, which will ensure its continuation beyond our own involvement. I propose, in essence, to transform what we have begun into something that transcends our individual participation." The implementation of this vision had occupied the latter months of spring. The Duke had worked with solicitors to establish the legal structures necessary for the organization's persistence. Evelyn had conducted interviews with potential board members, women whose intelligence and commitment to social improvement matched her own. The Dowager had contributed her particular talents for managing the more delicate negotiations with members of Parliament regarding the allocation of public resources to private charitable efforts. By the time May had arrived, with its characteristic richness of growth and its promise of coming summer, the framework had been firmly established. The organization, which had been initially conceived as Evelyn's project and had evolved into a shared endeavor of the Duke and Duchess, had now become something independent of them, an institution that would continue to protect vulnerable women long after both of them had departed the world. On the evening of the formal establishment of the board, the Duke had requested that Evelyn meet him in the library at twilight, that particular hour when daylight had not yet yielded entirely to darkness, when the world seemed suspended between two states of being. When she had arrived, she had found him holding not the pocket watch, but rather a small box, leather-bound, bearing the Ashcombe crest, similar in its appearance to the box that had contained his aunt's letters, but new. "This contains," he had said, "letters from the women we have assisted through our organization, letters expressing gratitude, but more importantly, letters describing how the security we provided permitted them to construct lives of genuine independence, letters describing children educated rather than abandoned, letters describing futures that would otherwise have been impossible. I wanted you to see the consequence of your vision made tangible." Evelyn had opened the box to find dozens of letters, written in varied hands, expressing sentiments of profound gratitude and genuine transformation. She had read them with tears that she did not attempt to conceal, understanding with absolute clarity the magnitude of what they had together accomplished. "This is your legacy," the Duke had continued. "Not merely the organization itself, but the individuals within that organization, the women they have assisted, the children they have protected. This is what comes of choosing to be vulnerable, of choosing to permit yourself to be known, of choosing to direct your capabilities toward purposes that extend beyond the preservation of your own position." As twilight had deepened into evening, and the library had gradually transformed from a space illuminated by natural light to a space defined by candlelight, they had sat together surrounded by evidence of their shared impact upon the world. And Evelyn had understood, with a clarity that transcended intellectual comprehension, that the greatest gift love could offer was not romance or passion, though those were present, but rather the permission to be fully oneself in service of something larger than oneself. 1 year had passed since the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe had wed, a year that had been measured not merely in the passage of seasons, but in the transformation of two people who had entered into an arrangement of practical necessity and had emerged from it bound together by something far more substantial than any legal contract could enforce. The occasion of their anniversary had coincided, by deliberate design rather than accident, with the spring gathering of Parliament. The household had filled with guests, both family and those who had become family through the work of the charitable organization. The Dowager Countess had taken particular pleasure in orchestrating the celebration, ensuring that it reflected both the dignity of the occasion and the genuine warmth that now characterized the household. In the evening, the Duke had requested a private audience with his wife before the formal celebration was to commence. He had led her to a room that Evelyn had not previously entered, a room that appeared to have been specifically prepared for this purpose, illuminated by candles arranged with meticulous care, the walls adorned with flowers that had been specially cultivated in the hothouses. "I wished," he had said, "to mark this anniversary in a manner that reflected the magnitude of its significance. 1 year ago, we entered into this marriage believing it to be a matter of practical arrangement. 1 year ago, we both understood ourselves to be entering into an agreement designed to remedy crisis. And yet, in the passage of these 12 months, what has transpired has been entirely other than what either of us anticipated." He had withdrawn from his pocket not the watches, both the old one that had been stopped and the new one that continued its persistent ticking, but rather a simple band of gold, identical in substance and design to the rings they already wore. "I wish," he had continued, "to renew the vows I took 1 year ago, to renew them not with the reservation that characterized my first expression, but with the absolute certainty that I would choose this marriage, would choose you, would choose this life, regardless of all circumstance. I wish to stand before you and declare that my heart has been entirely and completely transformed by your presence." Evelyn had stepped toward him and had taken the ring he offered, and together they had renewed the vows with a thoroughness and an authenticity that the first recitation had lacked. The words, which had emerged from the structure of ecclesiastical tradition at their first marriage, had now become genuinely personal expressions of commitment that extended far beyond the legal and social requirements that vows were designed to satisfy. That evening, at the celebration which followed, the Duke and Duchess had appeared together in a manner that communicated the absolute integration of their partnership. They had danced not with the careful distance that characterized social custom, but with an ease that suggested genuine comfort in one another's presence. They had spoken with guests not as separate entities performing complementary roles, but as individuals united in purpose and understanding. The Dowager Countess had observed the proceedings with visible satisfaction and had remarked to Mrs. Bell, with her characteristic directness, that she had witnessed in this household something she had begun to doubt existed in the modern world, a marriage characterized by genuine partnership, mutual respect, and authentic affection. As the evening had drawn toward its conclusion, and most of the guests had departed to their various residences, the Duke had taken Evelyn to their private chamber. They had stood together at the window overlooking the gardens, now fully awakened into spring growth, the trees entirely leafed, the flowers beginning their explosive blooming. "I have been contemplating," he had said quietly, "what the future might hold for us. I have concluded that I wish to ensure that the work we have begun, both the charitable organization and the work of understanding what it means to love authentically, continues to expand and deepen. I have concluded that I wish to provide you with every resource, every support, every facility that might permit you to maximize your impact upon the world." "And what of your own development?" she had asked. "Your own continued transformation?" "That," he had replied, "proceeds continuously. I am beginning to understand that transformation is not a destination one reaches, but rather a process one inhabits. I am beginning to understand that the greatest luxury afforded to a man of my station is not the maintenance of power, but rather the opportunity to learn continuously from someone whose perspective challenges my assumptions." He had taken her hand and had drawn the renewed ring upon her finger, the ring that was identical to its predecessor, but carried a different meaning now, symbolizing not the initiation of their bond, but rather its renewal and deepening. Outside, the London night continued in its customary fashion, the sounds of the city muffled by distance, the stars visible despite the ambient light, the world persisting in its indifferent rotation. But within that room, within the circle of candlelight that defined their private space, a man and woman who had begun as strangers bound by necessity had become partners in the ongoing work of building a life characterized not by the avoidance of vulnerability, but rather by its complete and honest expression. The pocket watch, now wound perpetually forward, continued its steady ticking, measuring not what had been lost, but all that continued to be gained through the courageous choice to remain present with another person's truth. Summer arrived with its characteristic abundance, transforming the gardens at Ashcombe House into a testament to the meticulous care that decades of cultivation had rendered possible. Yet it was not merely the physical landscape that had undergone expansion. The charitable organization, which had been conceived in crisis and had been nurtured through the deliberate efforts of the Duke and Duchess, had begun to flourish into something that extended far beyond the initial geographical boundaries they had envisioned. By late June, branches had been established in 12 cities across England and Scotland. The network of women managing each branch had begun to develop their own innovations, their own methodologies, their own understandings of how to address the particular vulnerabilities that characterized their respective regions. Evelyn had transformed from the direct administrator of the organization into its architect and theorist, a role that suited her temperament far more effectively than the administrative management ever could have done. It was the Duke who had first suggested the possibility of establishing a training institute, an institution that would provide systematic education to women who wished to dedicate themselves to charitable work, who possessed the intellectual capacity and moral conviction to address social problems through structured methodology, rather than through the casual benevolence that had previously characterized women's charitable involvement. "What you have created," he had said one morning as they reviewed the quarterly reports from the various regional branches, "is not merely an organization. It is a profession. It is a way in which women of intelligence and capability might direct their talents toward purposes they find meaningful, might achieve recognition and authority through demonstrated competence rather than through accident of birth or marriage. A training institute would formalize what is already occurring informally across your network." The proposal had seized Evelyn's imagination immediately. By autumn, plans had begun to develop in earnest. The Duke had contributed considerably to the financial structure that would permit such an institute to operate independently of any individual patron. The Dowager Countess had lent her authority to the recruitment of women who might serve as instructors, women whose intellectual credentials and moral authority were beyond reproach, women who understood that the transmission of knowledge to younger women was a form of revolution conducted entirely within the bounds of respectability. During this period, something had shifted subtly in the character of Ashcombe House itself. The servants had begun to treat Evelyn with a deference that transcended the respect due to her position and extended toward genuine admiration for her capabilities. Mrs. Bell had begun to refer to her as Her Grace, with an emphasis that suggested the title was not merely honorific, but rather an acknowledgement of earned authority. It was near the end of August that Evelyn had discovered she was pregnant. She had not immediately informed the Duke, but had instead spent several days processing the information privately, contemplating what this meant for the work she was engaged in, for the trajectory of expansion that had begun to define her purpose. When she had finally shared the information with him, they had been standing on the rooftop garden, that space which the Duke had begun to claim as their particular refuge, the place where they conducted their most intimate conversations, away from the observation of household staff. "I am uncertain," she had said, "whether a child constitutes an expansion of my purpose or a limitation upon it. I am uncertain whether I can adequately manage both the development of the training institute and the responsibilities that attend motherhood." "Perhaps," the Duke had replied gently, "the question itself is constructed upon a false binary. Perhaps motherhood and purposeful work are not mutually exclusive conditions, but rather dimensions of the same commitment to the future. Perhaps a child would represent an extension of the work we have undertaken, not a distraction from it, but rather a deepening of it." He had taken her hand and had placed it upon her still flat abdomen. "I believe," he had continued, "that the child we will create together will be raised in circumstances that permit both parents to be fully themselves. That this child will be raised by a mother whose intellect is engaged in meaningful work, by a father who has learned to value authentic feeling rather than the performance of emotion. That this child will inherit not merely a title and an estate, but rather a model of partnership that transcends the structures within which either of us were raised." Autumn arrived with its particular richness, the leaves transforming into shades of copper and gold, the light becoming more angular and precise, the world seeming to concentrate its essence before yielding to winter's austerity. The establishment of the Training Institute had progressed beyond the planning stages and had entered into the realm of tangible reality. A property suitable for the purpose had been acquired in a location sufficiently proximate to London to permit accessibility while maintaining sufficient distance to provide the quiet necessary for serious intellectual work. The Duke and Duchess had collaborated intensively in the final stages of preparation, despite Evelyn's advancing pregnancy. She had reviewed curricula proposed by the instructors, had conducted interviews with the first cohort of young women who would constitute the Institute's inaugural class, had ensured that every particular of the physical space reflected the commitment to intellectual rigor that the Institute was designed to embody. By November, when the first class had convened, Evelyn had been visibly pregnant, a condition that might have prompted lesser women to retreat from public visibility to permit their condition to be treated as an embarrassment requiring concealment. Instead, she had continued to be present in the Institute, had lectured to the students regarding the philosophy and practice of systematic charity, had demonstrated through her own example that pregnancy was not a condition requiring the abandonment of meaningful work, but rather simply a circumstance requiring accommodation. The students, drawn from a range of social circumstances, united only by their demonstrated intelligence and their genuine commitment to charitable work, had received her with a respect that suggested they understood they were in the presence of a woman who was defining new possibilities for female engagement with the world. It was during this period that the Duke had begun to develop a particular interest in the legislative aspects of their organization's work. He had initiated a series of conversations with members of Parliament regarding the possibility of establishing statutory frameworks for the protection of vulnerable women, legislation that would place the charitable work upon a legal foundation rather than leaving it dependent upon the benevolence of individual patrons. These conversations had proven more productive than might have been anticipated. By December, a bill had been introduced in Parliament that incorporated many of the principles that Evelyn and the Duke had developed through their organization. The bill had not passed without objection, but the objections had been remarkably muted, a testament to the political authority that the Duke had accumulated through his combination of personal integrity and demonstrated competence. On the evening that the bill had been passed with a comfortable majority, the Duke had returned to Ashcombe House and had found Evelyn resting before the fire in the drawing room. She had been in considerable discomfort. The pregnancy had advanced to the point where extended periods of activity had become increasingly difficult, yet her expression had brightened immediately upon his arrival. "It passed," she had stated, understanding from his expression precisely what had transpired. "By a margin of 137 votes, he had confirmed. He had settled himself beside her and had taken her hand carefully, mindful of her physical state. "What began as your response to personal crisis has transformed into legislation that will protect thousands of women across the nation. The consequences of your vision are becoming embedded in the very structures that govern our society." "Our vision," she had corrected gently. "This could not have transpired without your political authority, without your willingness to place your reputation and your influence behind these ideas. What I developed in isolation would have remained precisely that, isolated. It is the combination of your capacity to navigate institutional power and my capacity to articulate ethical principle that has permitted this transformation. And that," he had replied, "is the precise nature of the partnership I have come to believe constitutes genuine strength. Neither of us alone could have accomplished what we have accomplished together." December arrived with the announcement that seemed to shimmer with symbolic resonance. The Duchess of Ashcombe had been safely delivered of a daughter, a child whose birth represented not merely the continuation of the family line, but something more significant, a new generation raised within a framework of genuine partnership between her parents, a new generation exposed from her earliest moments to the possibility of female intellectual agency and purposeful work. The child had been named Eleanor, a name that carried historical weight, that suggested both classical education and contemporary aspiration. And from the moment of her birth, Eleanor had become, in some sense, a symbol of the transformation that had occurred within Ashcombe House and rippled outward into the broader structures of society. The Duke had attended the birth, a decision that had scandalized the midwife initially, who had not been accustomed to men involving themselves in the physical processes of reproduction, yet he had remained present throughout, had held his wife's hand when the pain had threatened to overwhelm her, had been the first to receive the newborn child from the attending physician. The relationship between the Duke and Duchess had deepened in ways that transcended the previous intimacy they had established. The act of creating new life together had seemed to bind them in a manner that romance alone could not accomplish. They had become, in a profound sense, creators together, not merely of an organization or of legislative reform, but of an entirely new human being who would inherit their vision and presumably expand it in ways they could not yet anticipate. By spring of the following year, Evelyn had resumed her active participation in the Institute, though with modifications that reflected her new responsibilities as a mother. A suite of rooms had been established at the Institute, where Eleanor could remain while her mother lectured, attended by trusted staff members who had been trained in the particular methodologies of childcare that Evelyn favored, methodologies that emphasized gentle attention and intellectual stimulation rather than the rigid constraint that had characterized Victorian child-rearing practices more broadly. It was during this period that an unexpected development had occurred. The Duke's younger brother, Charles, had returned to England, not, as he had previously done, with a sense of inspection and criticism, but rather with an apparent desire to understand the transformation that had transpired within his brother's life. "I have been abroad for the better part of a decade," Charles had stated, "and I have had considerable time to reflect upon the assumptions I carried regarding what constitutes a successful life. I have come to recognize that my judgments regarding your marriage were not merely incorrect, but were rooted in a fundamentally distorted understanding of what it means for a man of our station to exercise authority and responsibility." The rapprochement between the brothers had occurred gradually, but it had seemed genuine. By the autumn of Eleanor's first year, Charles had begun to involve himself in the charitable organization, had demonstrated unexpected capability in the management of financial matters related to its expansion, and had seemed to develop genuine regard for his sister-in-law's work. More significantly, Charles had begun to speak of his own desire to establish a household, to marry for genuine affection rather than for political advantage, to incorporate into his own life something of the authenticity that characterized his brother's marriage. It was the Dowager Countess who had observed these developments with evident satisfaction, and had remarked to Evelyn that she believed she was witnessing the emergence of a new generation of aristocrats, men who understood that their authority derived not from the suppression of feeling, but rather from the integration of authentic emotion into the structures of power they occupied. 3 years had passed since the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe had first wed. 3 years that had witnessed the transformation of not merely their personal circumstances, but the broader landscape of social possibility for women engaged in meaningful work. The Training Institute had expanded to accommodate twice as many students as the original projection had anticipated. The legislation protecting vulnerable women had been refined and expanded through successive parliamentary sessions. The regional branches of the charitable organization had developed into a network that extended across the entire United Kingdom. Eleanor had grown from an infant into a small girl of considerable personality, a child who spent her mornings in the nursery and her afternoons at the institute where her mother lectured, a child who had begun to demonstrate a precocious interest in the mechanisms by which charitable work was organized and administered. She would sit quietly in the gallery overlooking the lecture hall, her small face absorbed in concentration, and her presence seemed to communicate to the students that this work had consequences that extended across generations. The Duke had continued to evolve in his understanding of what his political authority might accomplish. He had become, without ever seeking the designation, one of the most influential voices advocating for the expansion of female involvement in spheres previously reserved to men. His authority had been strengthened rather than diminished by his willingness to employ that authority in service of principles that transcended his immediate self-interest. It was during the spring of their 4th year together that a significant proposal had been advanced, one that would have been unthinkable merely 3 years previously. The Prime Minister had requested a private audience with the Duke, during which he had suggested the possibility of a significant political advancement. The exact nature of the proposal had remained confidential, but it had been sufficiently substantial that it would have required the Duke to assume additional responsibility, greater public visibility, and presumably greater constraint upon his personal autonomy. The Duke had requested time to consider the proposal and had spent considerable energy reflecting upon whether the advancement represented genuine opportunity or subtle limitation. He had ultimately chosen to decline the position, a decision that had surprised many observers but which had seemed perfectly consonant with the trajectory of his life. "I have concluded," he had stated to Evelyn as they walked through the gardens at Ashcombe House, "that the advancement in question would have required a return to the performance of authority that I have spent years learning to transcend. It would have demanded that I maintain emotional distance in order to preserve political credibility. It would have positioned me as separate from the authentic commitments that have come to define my life. Therefore, I have declined it." "Do you regret the decision?" Evelyn had asked carefully. "No," he had replied with absolute certainty. I regret only that such a choice was ever presented, as though the advancement of career and the maintenance of personal authenticity were necessarily opposed to one another. But I am beginning to understand that the world changes slowly, and that my choice to remain engaged with the work we have begun together, rather than pursuing the political trajectory that society prescribes, is itself a form of authority that influences the world in ways that higher rank could not accomplish. It was during this same period that the Duke and Duchess had begun to contemplate the future of Eleanor. They had determined that she would be educated not in the traditional manner prescribed for girls of her station, but rather through exposure to the work that characterized both her parents' lives. She would attend the institute alongside her mother. She would observe parliamentary proceedings alongside her father. She would be raised with the understanding that her sex was not a limitation upon her capacity to contribute meaningfully to the world, but rather simply a circumstance that might require particular forms of navigation. By autumn of that 4th year, it had become evident that Evelyn was pregnant once more, a second child whose arrival would presumably expand the family structure and presumably amplify the lessons being transmitted to the next generation regarding the possibilities of authentic partnership and purposeful work. 5 years had elapsed since the Duke of Ashcombe and Evelyn Hearthmere had wed in what had seemed to both of them at the time to be an arrangement of pure convenience. 5 years that had witnessed the establishment of structural transformations that would persist long after both of them had departed the world. 5 years during which a marriage that had begun in crisis had been transformed into a model that others had begun tentatively to emulate. The second child, a son named William Benedict Vane, had arrived in the spring of their 5th year together, greeted with the same absence of restraint that had characterized Eleanor's birth. He represented not the perpetuation of title and inheritance in the traditional sense, but rather the continuation of a legacy that extended beyond the merely dynastic. Both children had been raised within an environment that was, for the Victorian era, radically experimental. They had been exposed from their earliest moments to the concept that their gender did not determine their worth, that intellectual capacity transcended the boundaries of sex, that purposeful engagement with the world represented a legitimate aspiration, regardless of the accidents of birth that had positioned them as a duke's daughter and son. Eleanor, now 5 years old, had already demonstrated the particular characteristics that suggested she would inherit something of her mother's intellectual intensity. William, at 2 years old, had displayed a temperament that seemed to suggest he might inherit something of his father's careful observation and his capacity to synthesize complex information into coherent frameworks. The Duke and Duchess had continued to evolve in their understanding of what their partnership might accomplish. They had established not only the Training Institute and the network of charitable organizations, but had also begun to develop theoretical frameworks regarding the role of women in social reform, frameworks that were beginning to be circulated amongst progressive intellectual circles both within England and abroad. More importantly, they had established a household that functioned as a living demonstration of what was possible when two people chose to remain authentically present with one another, when they chose to employ their respective capabilities in service of purposes that transcended personal aggrandizement, when they chose to permit their love to be witnessed rather than concealed. It was during the spring of their 5th year that the Duke had made a decision that seemed to represent the culmination of the transformation that had been underway since the moment he had first permitted himself to be vulnerable with Evelyn. He had announced his intention to step back from active parliamentary involvement, to dedicate himself more fully to the administrative and theoretical aspects of their charitable work, to permit younger men with different perspectives to claim the political authority he had previously occupied. "I have begun to understand," he had explained to Evelyn, "that authority is not a zero-sum substance that diminishes as it is distributed. Rather, it is something that grows through transmission, through the deliberate choice to elevate others into positions from which they might contribute their own perspectives and capabilities. By stepping back, I create space for others to occupy. By yielding authority, I do not diminish my own influence. I amplify it through the mechanisms of delegation and development." The decision had been received with expressions of astonishment by those within political circles who had assumed that a man of the Duke's station and capability would naturally continue to pursue the advancement that such positions offered. Yet those who understood the deeper currents of transformation that had been occurring within society had recognized the wisdom of his choice. By the autumn of their 5th year, as the Duke and Duchess prepared for what would be their most ambitious undertaking to date, the establishment of a secondary institute that would provide advanced education to women who had completed the training in the primary institute, they had seemed to embody something that went far beyond the merely personal achievement of a successful marriage. They had seemed to embody the possibility of a different future, a future in which power could be wielded in service of authentic commitment, in which authority derived from integrity rather than from the suppression of feeling, in which a marriage could constitute not a retreat from the world's demands, but rather the deepest engagement with those demands. The pocket watch, which had once been stopped as a monument to fracture, continued its steady ticking, no longer a symbol of what had been lost, but rather a simple marker of time's persistent forward motion, of the infinite possibilities that remained to be realized through the combination of courage, commitment, and the willingness to remain authentically present with another human being. 20 years had passed. The gardens at Ashcombe House had achieved a perfection that spoke to the deliberate cultivation of decades, the roses blooming with a richness that suggested they understood themselves to be part of a larger vision, the hedges sculpted with a precision that reflected the hand of groundskeepers who had been trained in their craft by those who understood that even the smallest details mattered. Yet the true transformation was not visible in the landscape, but rather in the structures that had been established, the lives that had been altered, the possibilities that had been created through the persistent choice to remain authentic in a world that demanded constant performance. Eleanor, now a woman of 25 years, had graduated from the Advanced Institute with distinction and had begun to establish herself as a theorist and practitioner in her own right. A woman whose voice was being heard in drawing rooms and academic circles, a woman whose work was extending the boundaries of what had seemed possible for women of her generation to accomplish. William, at 22, had chosen a different path, not the path of social reform that had characterized his parents' work, but rather the path of academic philosophy, a pursuit that seemed to reflect his father's capacity for abstract thought, combined with his mother's commitment to using intellectual capability in service of meaningful purpose. The charitable organization that had been born in crisis had expanded into a network of institutions that extended across the entire English-speaking world. The training institutes had produced hundreds of women who had gone forth to establish their own organizations, to implement their own innovations, to demonstrate through their own lives that the model of authentic partnership and purposeful work was not a unique aberration, but rather a template that could be replicated across various circumstances and contexts. The Dowager Countess Hartwick had passed away in her 84th year, leaving behind a legacy of stern wisdom and uncompromising commitment to excellence. She had witnessed the transformation of her nephew and his wife with an intensity that suggested she understood she was observing something significant occurring, something that transcended the merely personal and extended into the realm of genuine social evolution. Mrs. Bell had retired after nearly 50 years of service at Ashcombe House, choosing to spend her final years in a cottage on the estate, where she continued to be consulted by the household staff regarding matters of propriety and tradition. She had, in her own taciturn manner, acknowledged that the transformation occurring within the house from a monument to controlled distance into a space of genuine warmth and authenticity represented something approaching redemption. The Duke and Duchess, now in their 58th and 56th years respectively, had achieved the particular grace that comes from having lived in accordance with one's deepest commitments. They had begun to gradually yield administrative responsibilities to the next generation, their own children, their protégés, the countless women they had trained and mentored, yet they remained engaged with the theoretical and visionary aspects of their work. It was on a morning in spring, 20 years after their wedding, that the Duke had taken Evelyn to the rooftop garden, that space which had remained throughout their marriage as a refuge where they conducted their most intimate conversations. The city of London spread out before them, transformed through their lifetime into something different from what it had been, a city where women walked with greater confidence, where female intellectual capability was beginning to be acknowledged rather than suppressed, where the structures of charitable work had been altered through the persistent vision of those who believed such change was possible. "I have been reflecting," the Duke had said, his voice carrying the particular quality of contentment that characterized his speech in recent years, "upon the man I was before I knew you. That man was trapped within structures that he believed were immutable, that he believed represented the natural order of things. That man would have assessed our current circumstances and would have concluded they represented weakness, compromise, a failure to maintain proper authority. "And what does the man you have become conclude?" Evelyn had asked, though she believed she already understood. "The man I have become concludes," he had replied, "that the structures I believed were immutable were simply constructs, created by men of previous generations and perpetuated because they seemed to serve the interests of those in power. I have come to understand that what I believed was weakness, the capacity to be known, to permit oneself to need, to integrate authentic feeling into the exercise of authority, is precisely what constitutes genuine strength. The irony is that by yielding to what I was taught to regard as weakness, I have achieved far greater influence than I ever could have through the performance of invulnerability." He had taken her hand, a gesture so familiar after 20 years that it no longer required conscious execution, yet remained perpetually charged with meaning. "I have been thinking," he had continued, "about the pocket watch. Do you remember how it functioned as a symbol of fracture, of time stopped at the moment when everything seemed to shatter? I have concluded that the watch served another purpose as well. It served as a reminder that even stopped things can be wound forward, that time's imprisonment is never truly permanent, that there exists always the possibility of resumption, of continuation, of transformation." "And has your understanding of that transformed as well?" she had asked. "Yes," he had replied. "I have come to understand that the watch, and by extension our own marriage, serves as a testimony that human beings are capable of far more profound transformation than we typically permit ourselves to imagine. That a man trained from birth in emotional suppression can learn to feel authentically. That a woman constrained by circumstance can become an architect of social change. That two people can begin in crisis and create something that persists across decades, that influences the lives of thousands, that establishes possibilities for future generations." They had stood together in the spring sunlight, and the city had continued its indifferent rotation around them. The pocket watch, which had been placed long ago upon the mantelpiece of their private sitting room, continued its steady ticking, no longer a burden to be carried, no longer a monument to what had been lost, but rather simply a constant reminder of time's persistence, of the infinite possibilities that remain to be realized through authentic commitment and the willingness to remain present with another human being. The work would continue beyond them. Eleanor would expand it in directions they could not yet anticipate. William would contribute his own perspectives and capabilities. The next generation would inherit not merely a legacy of accomplishment, but a model of how authentic partnership could transform not only individual lives, but the broader structures of society itself. And perhaps in the end, that was the greatest gift that love could offer. Not romance or passion, though those were present, but rather the opportunity to construct a life so deeply aligned with one's authentic commitments that every moment becomes an expression of genuine purpose, and every act becomes a testimony to the possibility of meaningful transformation. In the candlelit chambers of our hearts, where truth dwells in silence before it becomes speech, there exists a profound wisdom that modern society has largely forgotten, that vulnerability is not the opposite of strength, but rather its truest expression. The Duke of Ashcombe began his life as a prisoner of necessity. He believed, as generations of men have believed, that authority required the suppression of authentic feeling, that power demanded the maintenance of distance, that love was a luxury that men of consequence could not afford to acknowledge. Yet in believing this, he had constructed a prison far more confining than any external circumstance could have created, a prison of his own making, sustained by his own conviction that authenticity was weakness. Evelyn, by contrast, had learned through painful circumstance that the world does not discriminate on the basis of justice. She had discovered that reputation is a currency uniquely fragile for women, that society judges female worth according to standards that are simultaneously impossible to meet and readily manipulated. Yet rather than permit these discoveries to crush her spirit, she had developed a quiet dignity, a refusal to accept the definitions that others attempted to impose upon her. And when these two people encountered one another, something miraculous occurred. Not because their meeting was orchestrated by fate or destiny, there is no such destiny, but because they each recognized in the other the possibility of becoming more fully themselves. The Duke recognized in Evelyn a woman who had survived circumstances that would have destroyed lesser spirits, and who had done so without sacrificing her capacity for tenderness. Evelyn recognized in the Duke a man who, despite all his training toward emotional detachment, remained capable of genuine feeling, a man whose control was not the expression of his nature, but rather a learned behavior imposed upon his nature. And so they made a choice, the most radical choice available to them. They chose to remain present with one another, not merely in the legal sense, though the law was certainly involved, but in the sense of genuine presence, the willingness to be known, to permit oneself to be vulnerable, to risk the particular injury that comes from allowing another person to see one's truth and choosing to remain present regardless of the consequences. This choice transformed them both. The Duke learned that authority does not require the suppression of feeling, but rather is deepened through the integration of authentic emotion into the exercise of power. Evelyn learned that her intellectual capabilities and moral vision were not luxuries to be hidden away to make others comfortable, but rather were precisely the gifts the world required in order to evolve toward greater justice. But perhaps more importantly, their choice transformed the world around them. Their willingness to make their love visible rather than concealing it created permission for others to do the same. Their refusal to accept the prescribed roles that society demanded created space for others to reject those roles as well. Their insistence that partnership was not a compromise, but rather an amplification of capability, demonstrated to others that collaboration need not diminish individual power, but rather could exponentially increase it. In our contemporary age, we have become suspicious of such profound transformation. We have been taught to believe that people do not fundamentally change, that character is fixed, that the scripts society has written for us are immutable. Yet the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe stand as testimony to the falsity of such beliefs. Human beings are capable of extraordinary transformation when given permission to do so. We are capable of learning, of evolving, of becoming profoundly different from who we were. What is required is not a miracle, but rather 3 simple conditions. First, we must encounter someone who reflects to us the possibility of who we might become. Second, we must be willing to undertake the difficult work of unlearning the limiting beliefs we have internalized. Third, we must choose, repeatedly and deliberately, to remain present with authentic commitment even when doing so is difficult. The pocket watch that features so prominently in this narrative serves as metaphor and testimony to this truth. Time does not stop. Even when we construct elaborate defenses against feeling, even when we attempt to freeze ourselves in positions of control and distance, time continues to move forward. And when we finally wind that watch forward again, when we finally permit ourselves to feel, to be vulnerable, to remain authentically present with another, we discover that time has not abandoned us. Rather, it has simply been waiting for us to resume our own participation in it. This is the fundamental message that this story seeks to communicate, that love is not a luxury, but rather a necessity, that vulnerability is not weakness, but rather the foundation upon which genuine strength is built, that the greatest authority we can exercise is the authority derived from choosing to be authentic in a world that demands constant performance. Dear listeners and beloved followers of Victorian romance, audio stories, if this narrative has touched your heart, if it has stirred within you reflections upon your own journey toward authenticity and genuine connection, we invite you to join our community of kindred souls. Subscribe to our channel and ensure that you never miss the unfolding of these intimate tales of transformation, vulnerability, and the triumph of love over circumstance. Your subscription is the vessel through which these stories continue to reach those who need them most. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your reflections, your own experiences with vulnerability and authentic connection. We believe that each listener brings wisdom to this shared space, and we welcome the testimony of your own hearts. Tell us, what did this story mean to you? How has it challenged your understanding of strength and vulnerability? What truth did it illuminate? Your voice matters. Your presence in this community creates the conditions through which stories become not merely entertainment, but rather mirrors in which we glimpse the possibility of our own transformation. Thank you for permitting us to share this intimate journey with you. On behalf of the entire team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, we extend our profound gratitude for the time you have devoted to this narrative. We recognize that in choosing to listen to this story, you have offered us a precious gift, the gift of your attention, your emotional engagement, your willingness to journey alongside characters who are learning to become authentically themselves. We believe that stories possess the power to transform consciousness. We believe that through narrative, We can glimpse possibilities that seemed previously unimaginable. We believe that the intimate tales we share together create the conditions through which social evolution becomes possible. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for permitting us to participate in your journey toward greater authenticity, greater courage, and greater connection. May you find in your own life the courage to wind your own pocket watch forward. May you discover the possibility of genuine partnership. May you choose, as the Duke of Ashcombe learned to choose, that vulnerability is not weakness, but rather the truest expression of strength. Until we meet again in the candlelit chambers of story, we remain Victorian Romance. Audio stories with deepest gratitude and warmest regards.